You're listening to Dallas Theological Seminary's Chapel Podcast, a clear voice in chaotic times.
Thank you and good morning. It's great to be with all of you and to have my first chance to welcome you to the fall semester of 2006 at Dallas Seminary. It's always a memorable experience to hear the singing in this place. Kind of wish you could package it and take it with you when you go to some of these dull spots where they don't sing. It's wonderful to have it here. I've been away for a couple of months on a little vacation mixed with a mini sabbatical. And while I was gone, we had a number of folks from the seminary preach in my place. And it's always fun to come back and hear people's response. And among them, we had Dr. Ramesh Richard, who is a part of the faculty, of course. And one of our parishioners said, "I just want to thank you for Ravi's ministry. It was wonderful." I said it really wasn't Ravi, it was Ramesh. He said, "Yeah, I'll tell you, Zacharias is out of this world." No, it wasn't Ravi Zacharias. He said, whoever it was, he knew what he was doing. Well, 1 out of 3 he got right. And I'll never forget the time the lady walked up and said, "Oh, Dr. Dobson, I want to thank you for your books. And would you just sign this?" But she'd been sitting through the entire service. And so she brings one of Dobson's books, and I sign it. Jim Dobson, happy birthday. They don't know. Well, they just come, you know. Well, it was 47 years ago I first sat where you're sitting today. The faculty numbered about 19, as I recall, some of them part-time. Student body was less than 350, but the sense of bewilderment and intimidation and fear, that sense was all the same. It hasn't changed. I know how many of you feel. You couldn't feel more uneasy than I felt that first few weeks and few months as the year unfolded and we got underway in our studies. I'd never been around this kind of context. I'd never known people this bright. I'd never sat along those that were that capable and gifted. And I had no idea where any of that would lead, just like most of you. And I remember thinking, this is absolutely the truth. I remember sitting here thinking, this chapel time is essential for me because there's no competition, there's no grading, there's very little academic about it. It's a place to have my soul softened and my heart nourished. And I learned over those 4 years how true that is. And so on the front end of this fall semester, let me urge you to take time for this hour, for this time. You will find as your studies intensify that this will be the first and easiest thing to go. It'll be the quickest decision for you to make. You'll be having that test coming up. You'll be facing the pressure of the semester, and there'll be nobody demanding anything of you as it has to do with being at the chapel. That'll be here, and let me add, really only here, that you can sit without needing to take a note, though you may want to on occasion. You can listen, and you can search your heart, and in the self-examination, you'll find that ministry begins to make up its mind for you. And I urge you if I could get on my knees and make it more effective, I plead with you to stay with this time of devotion. Now, during the few times I'll be speaking through the semesters this year and next, I will focus on things that I believe are so needed in ministry, none of which are academic, none of which demand a high IQ. None of these things is there a course provided to teach on. But these are the things that will make you or break you as a woman or man of God. These kind of things. It was the prophet Micah who asked, what does the Lord require of you? Well, what's expected? And then he goes through a list of possibilities. 1,000 rams, 10,000 rivers of oil. Do I need to give my firstborn for the sins of my soul? Is that what God requires? No, says the prophet. No, none of the above. Do what's right. Do justice. Love kindness. Walk humbly with your God. I want to focus on the second of the three out of Micah 6:8. I want to focus on that wonderful concept, that vital virtue that unfortunately and regrettably is often forgotten, the virtue of kindness, being kind. Because just as you will find it easy to begin to skip chapel and overlook the need for time to have your heart softened and your soul prepared and nourished, so you will find in ministry that kindness will fly away because it doesn't come naturally, and because you will find, regrettably, that it isn't frequently found even in the church, especially when people need it the most. Kindness takes time. Following this time with you, I'm going to drop by and meet with a friend I've known since the 70s. He's dying of brain cancer, may not live a month. He doesn't need any verse exegeted, though I could do that. He doesn't really need a sermon, though I have a barrel of those. He needs a touch of kindness, and his wife as well, who knows that in 2 months his voice will no longer be heard in the home because he'll be dead, barring a miracle. Last Sunday, I met a couple, and they talked briefly with me, and he was sort of grim-faced, and she was very somber. And he said, we've sort of come to this place on a lark. Neither one of them had a Bible, and both of them sort of said on behalf of each other, we've sort of been at each other's throat. Matter of fact, he said, we've been away from each other for months. And we thought, well, maybe we need God. And somebody said, well, they talk about him over at that place, and they pointed in our direction, and they came. They needed kindness from me. I want you to hear a story. Just sit back and relax, okay? 20 years ago, I drove a cab for a living. When I arrived at 2:30 in the morning, the building was dark except for a single light in a ground floor window. Under these circumstances, many cab drivers would just honk once or twice, wait a minute, then drive away. But I had seen too many impoverished people who depended on taxis as their only means of transportation to drive away. Unless the situation smelled of danger, I always went to the door. This passenger might be someone who really needs my assistance. So I walked to the door and knocked. Just a moment, answered a frail, elderly voice. I could hear something being dragged across the floor. After a long pause, the door opened. A small woman in her 80s stood before me wearing a print dress and a pillbox hat with a veil pinned on it, like somebody out of the 40s movies. By her side was a small nylon suitcase. The apartment looked as if no one had lived in it for years. All the furniture was covered with white sheets. There were no clocks on the walls, no knickknacks or utensils on the counters. In the corner was a cardboard box filled with photos and glassware. "Would you carry this bag out to the car for me?" she said. I took the suitcase out and returned to assist the woman. She took my arm and walked slowly toward the curb. She kept thanking me for my kindness. "Oh, it's nothing," I told her. "I just try to treat all my passengers the way I would want my mother treated." When we got in the cab, she gave me an address. Then she said, "Oh, by the way, could you drive through downtown?" "It's not the shortest way," I answered quickly. "Oh, I don't mind. I'm in no hurry. I'm on my way to a hospice." I looked in the rearview mirror, and her eyes were glistening. I don't have any family left," she said, almost to herself. "The doctor says I don't have very long." I quietly reached over and shut off the meter. "What route would you like me to take?" For the next 2 hours, we drove all around the city. She showed me the building where she had once worked as an elevator operator. We drove through the neighborhood where she and her husband had lived when they were newlyweds. She had me pull up in front of a furniture warehouse that had once been a ballroom where she had gone dancing as a girl. Sometimes she'd ask me to slow down in front of a particular building or corner. She would sit staring into the darkness, saying nothing. As the first hint of sun was creasing the horizon, she suddenly said, "Okay, I'm ready. Let's go now." We drove in silence to the address she had given me. It was a low building, like a small convalescent home with a driveway that passed under a portico. 2 orderlies came out to the cab. As soon as we pulled up, they were solicitous and intent, watching her every move. They were expecting her. I opened the trunk, took out the small suitcase, carried it to the door. The woman was already seated in a wheelchair. "How much do I owe you?" she asked. "No, you don't owe me anything," I said. "Oh, you have to make a living," she answered. "Oh, there are other passengers," I responded. Almost without thinking, I bent over and gave her a hug, and she held on to me tightly. "You gave an old woman a little bit of joy," she said. "Thank you." I squeezed her hand, then walked into the dim morning light. Behind me, a door shut. It was the sound of the closing of a life. I didn't pick up any more passengers that shift. I drove aimlessly, lost in thought for the rest of the day. I could hardly talk. What if that woman had gotten in an angry driver earlier that morning, or one who was impatient? What if I had refused to take the run, or had honked once and driven away? On a quick review, I don't think I have done anything more important in all my life. I love that story. Sort of helps me allow life to make up its mind again. You need to remember that story, because I understand the schedule, I understand the curriculum, I understand what's in front of you better than any of you understand. I know what you're facing. I also know, after almost 45 years of ministry, the stuff you'll be dealing with. The times you will want to be anything but kind. because it is so much easier to bear a grudge and hate in return, or get back, or get even. A friend of mine gave me a note. Hate destroys the vessel it's kept in. Revenge never healed a wound. Truth be told, some of you have arrived pretty beaten up. There's one thing all of us have in common: we've been mistreated by somebody. Some of you have known abuse, misunderstanding. Even though you're young, you've already felt the sting of not being understood by those you thought would understand. It's just starting. And all of this has a way of siphoning your tank of kindness. It can make you hard. And you can get on with hard. You can get along with it. In fact, some will even respect you more because you're tough. But I urge you not to be. At the conclusion of a series of commands in Ephesians 4, Paul winds up by saying, be kind, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ forgave you. It is required that you love kindness. It's required that you love it. You model chesed. Wonderful old Hebrew term. When you say it right, something lands on the back of the neck of the guy in front of you. Chesed. Mercy, kindness. Another story is recorded in Genesis, beginning at chapter 38, of a 17-year-old boy who had a family he needed to forgive in a matter of time. Nice place, Swindoll. Chapter 37, not 38. Jacob has a son named Joseph. He's 17 years old. Joseph's brothers hate him because he tattles on them, and as a result, they team up and think first to killing him, and then they decide, no, they'll sell him. So they sell him for a handful of coins, and he winds up in another culture as a slave, doesn't know the language, abandoned by his brothers, thought dead by his father. He ultimately gets a job as a houseboy for a military official named Potiphar. Potiphar watches him, and over a period of time, he gains Potiphar's respect, and by, Joseph earns the role of Potiphar's special assistant. He's in charge of everything in the house. Unfortunately, included in the house is a wife with a wayward eye, and she lusts after Joseph. And she attempts to seduce him more than a few times. She makes herself available to him, and finally, when no one's around, she lurches for him and grabs him and says to him in bold, uncertain terms, "Lie with me. Let's have sex. Nobody's around." Joseph runs. She's still got one of his garments, and she screams rape. And of all things, he winds up in an Egyptian dungeon. This is a young man who really hasn't done anything wrong. Well, he was a 17-year-old that didn't act wisely. Who acts wisely at 17? He's a young man who doesn't know his way around the culture, and he's bought by this man he doesn't know, and he's living in this home. He's never seen such luxury, and now he winds up with a false charge against him. I mean, you talk about a reason to hate. In the meantime, God knows where he is and watches over him carefully. I love it that you know the story, so you know where it's going. By and by, he gets out of that Egyptian prison and winds up second in command in Egypt. prime minister. Now, back at the ranch, the brothers have no thought of him, and the dad pretty well put him out of his mind. But a drought happens, a famine occurs. Because Joseph has planned wisely, there's plenty of food in Egypt. And when the drought reaches all the way to Joseph's original homeland, the father says to the brothers, you need to go and get food or we'll die. What they don't know is that the one they'll be talking to is the brother they ripped off. In chapter 45, there's a great moment. This is what you call finding the sweet spot of revenge. This is Joseph's moment to shove their face in it. They don't even know who he is yet. So they're standing there with their hat in their hand, hoping to get a handout. And here stands this Egyptian-speaking prime minister, now a man they don't recognize, but he knows who they are. I love stories like that, where the reader knows what the people in the story don't. Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried, have everyone go out from me. So there was no man with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. That's great. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard of it. And Joseph said to his brother, I am Joseph. I am Joseph. I'm really Joseph. I'm your brother. I'm Joseph. Is my father still alive? His brothers couldn't answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. I reckon. Because they thought he would be like they are. And Joseph said to his brothers, please come closer to me. They came closer, and he said, I'm your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Now it all washes over them. All the guilt, all the shame, all the feelings, all the fear, all the stuff that makes for sin. And they relive it in their minds, and they see before them the man who, with just one turn of his thumb, can send them to eternity. They'll never get back even to see their families. But listen, verse 5, do not be grieved or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. That is kindness. Pause right here. I know you know what's coming, but pause right here. Would you have done that? Please don't answer out loud. Just leave it all. Just leave it right there in your mind. Before you're through at Dallas Seminary, I hope your answer will be yes. I understand the practical outworking of the theology and the truths of the scriptures that I've learned in these classrooms, but what I've really gained from this truth is another way of life that I never had before my training began. I've learned by watching men and women of kindness. I've learned by being around students who were kind with me when I lost time at school because of a sickness or because of a loss in my family or the death of a child or a breakdown emotionally. Whatever may have been the cause, they showed kindness to me. I'm different today. Joseph said, don't be angry with yourselves. The implication is, I'm not angry with you. He settled that a long time ago. Who knows where? In the dungeon? Working in Potiphar's house? Back when he was learning a language and a culture, both unfamiliar to him? We're not told. We just know he's different than they are. God sent me before you to preserve life. His theology is right on. God isn't almost sovereign. God is absolutely sovereign. There are no accidents. There are no mistakes. There are no coincidences. This is an event that was planned before there was time or matter. Planned by the Godhead for his glory and for my good. He says the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. Look at the theology, verse 7. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Chesed. That's what it is. He's loving chesed. He's loving mercy. He's modeling kindness. The real exam is taking place right now. He's passing with flying colors. Verse 9, he repeats, hurry, go to my father, say to him, thus says your son, Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay. Notice God did this. God's made that. God's caused this. If that isn't enough, verse 15, he kissed all his brothers. You imagine what they felt when he started toward them? And with each one of them, he planted a kiss on their cheeks. And he took time to tell them how much he had missed them and how fully he forgave them. Don't you like the end of verse 15? Afterwards, his brothers talked with him. Talk about a family reunion. So he sends them back to get the dad. I love the little line because it tells me Joseph is still a realist. Look at verse 24. So he sent his brothers away, and as they departed, he said to them, don't quarrel on the journey. Now there's a boy that still remembers the brothers. You are always quarreling. You are a family of quarrelers. You have argued your way to adulthood and beyond, and you're still fighters. Stop it. Get daddy. Bring him back. Cut to the chase, chapter 47, verse 27. Daddy comes. The brothers and the families come. They're not given the ghetto, they're given the best land at Goshen. They're not loaned the land, they're given the land. And Joseph doesn't do it and split. Joseph does it and stays. And he watches his daddy grow older. It's a very great scene in verse 27. Now Israel, the name now given for Jacob, lived in the land of Egypt and Goshen. They acquired property in it and were fruitful and became very numerous. Jacob, please notice this. I saw it when I first was teaching on Joseph. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. That's how old Joseph was when he left his dad. Same amount of time Jacob has now lived in Egypt. So the length of Jacob's life was 147 years. When it drew near, he blessed his sons, and finally, verse 33, chapter 49, after he finishes charging his sons, he drew his feet into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. I love the way the Bible puts that. He then, in the words of the Stanton who stood beside Lincoln when he died, he became a part of the ages. Jacob's gone. And Joseph weeps. Still tender, still kind, still having feelings for his father. I know you well enough to know, because I am one with you in so many ways, that it is very, very easy for us as we reach adulthood to see our parents in a different light. Be careful with that. Be really careful. Without them, you wouldn't even be here. I know they haven't been everything they should have been. And maybe they haven't been everything they should have been for you. But they're your mom and they're your dad. Though they don't know how to say it quite like this, they love you and admire you and live for the day you'll stand and speak for God. Someday you'll lose them, like I've lost mine. And you'll have feelings that you just wish like crazy you would have expressed, like Joseph must have felt. After saying goodbye to his dad, and they take care of the burial, they're back together for this last time in Genesis chapter 50, verse 19. Joseph says to his brothers, "Don't be afraid. Am I in God's place?" See, when you take revenge, you take God's role. Vengeance is God's job, not your job. I could name a dozen people that have done me wrong, really wrong, in my lifetime. It's God's job to deal with them. Not one of those people has asked forgiveness. There's a break in our relationship, not because I want it, but they want it. And I could let that eat me up. And as best I can say, I've not really caused it. There were misunderstandings. There were things done and said that never got bridged. I would love to know that by the time I'm gone, there's peace with all of them, but there won't be. Joseph wants to make certain with these men, his brothers, and he says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result." Verse 21, so he comforted them, here it is, and he spoke kindly to them. Isn't that great? He starts off being kind when they first meet. He's still kind, and he's kind when they die, or when he dies and is gone. There's still kindness. I want to leave with you three thoughts that will help, I think, as it relates to kindness. All three from the story. Number one, when I realize I'm not in God's place, Joseph's words, the desire for revenge fades. When I realize I'm not in God's place, the desire for revenge fades. So whoever it is whose face is on your dartboard, spend the first few weeks at seminary getting it erased. You're not in God's place. Furthermore, your retaliation would be nothing compared to what God can do if that's his plan. He'll take care of them. Second, when I acknowledge God's sovereign hand in all that's happened, the grip of bitterness is released. Joseph said God was in this. I see God from start to finish. Certainly I wouldn't have planned it. Some of it's been horrible, painful, difficult, sometimes impossible for me on my own strength to bear. But I see God's hand in it. When I acknowledge God's sovereign hand in all that's happened, the grip of bitterness is released. Third, when I'm truly free of revenge and bitterness, there is plenty of room in my heart left for kindness. And not until. We were in Israel this last May. Some faculty members went with us along with their wives and husbands. We were there for about 10 or 11 days. Thought often about how good it was that we went when we did and got back when we did, in light of what's happened in the months that have passed recently. While there, we were at one of those sites just above the Mount of Olives. As you look down on it, and right in front of us was an old wall, almost black with age. Just beyond the wall was a cemetery full of Jews who've now passed. What a wonderful guide that particular day, and while we were standing there, I just said to her, would you read us one of those epitaphs? And she said, sure, which one? I said, well, how about that one? I picked one randomly. The epitaph read, in her words as she translated it, this man was an Auschwitz survivor, born in Austria and died in Jerusalem after the war. She then said, he was known as a man who spent his whole life chasing chesed. Isn't that an interesting phrase? I said, the other people with me who were all unaware of the language said, And I said, on their behalf and mine, the last part again? She said, it says chasing chesed. She said, actually, it's a common Israeli figure of speech to describe a person who spends his life pursuing kindness. Wow. An Auschwitz survivor chasing chesed. Do that. Wouldn't it be great? A Dallas Seminary survivor chasing chesed. Father, I adore you. Lay my life before you. How I love you, Jesus.